Iruka was awoken by the sudden chill of the morning air as his duvet was tugged away. He yelped, grasping for it, but the umbu at the end of the bed neatly flicked it up into his arms and out of reach. "Wakey wakey, Iruka," he said brightly. "Were you up late last night again? It's almost 10. You won't have time for breakfast." Iruka groaned and curled into a ball on the mattress. "You know, one of the perks of living alone is that I can sleep in as long as I want," he said, voice hoarse from sleep. "What are you doing here, Eagle?" "I was passing by and noticed your curtains were shut," Eagle said. He absent-mindedly folded the duvet over twice and then tucked it under his arm. "You have an appointment with the Hokage in 40 minutes. "I do." Iruka's eyes shot open again and he lifted his head. "But that's on Tuesday." "It is Tuesday." "Shit." Eagle clicked his tongue at Iruka's language, but Iruka was already scrambling out of bed, running a hand through his loose hair and getting his fingers caught in the tangles. He could really use a shower. Did he have time for a shower? "Thanks for the wake-up call," he flung over his shoulder as he hurried towards the bathroom. Eagle was gone by the time Iruka had showered, brushed his teeth and briefly inspected his face in the hopes he might need to shave. No such luck yet. He pulled on some clothes, noting Eagle had made the bed, and then checked his watch before rushing into the kitchen to find something he could eat on the way. He needn't have bothered to hurry, there were 2 slices of toast sitting in the toaster, cold now, but Iruka appreciated the gesture. He slathered on far too much jam and then left the house, munching as he went. He was still 10 minutes late when he skidded to a halt in front of the door to the Hokage's office, panting lightly. "About time," the umbu on guard drawled. "Oh great! It was him." "Shut up, hound," Iruka managed as he got his breath back. "You know, the Hokage's time is valuable. I know for a fact that you didn't have anywhere else to be this morning, so how are you still late?" "I'll be even more late if you don't let me in," Iruka said, scowling. "And how the hell do you know what I was doing this morning?" "Eagle dropped by," Hound said blandly, and Iruka filed that betrayal away for later use. Eagle owed him way more than cold toast for ratting him out. "Yeah, well, it's still creepy that you guys gossip about me. Now open the damn door." Hound regarded him without moving, taking his damn time. What a hypocrite, all that fuss about Iruka's tardiness, yet now he was single-handedly making Iruka even later. Then Hound made a little tisk sound and raised a hand to Iruka's face. Iruka was so surprised that he didn't even jerk back. He blinked rapidly as Hound's gloved hand cupped his jaw and a thumb gently rubbed the corner of his mouth. It was the softest touch he'd ever received from Hound, who was more prone to dragging Iruka around or twisting his arms up behind his back, and therefore wholly out of character. Then Hound let him go and showed Iruka the smear of jam on his thumb, and Iruka felt himself flush darkly in mortification. "Maybe learn some table manners," Hound said, and Iruka tried to smack his hand away, but Hound pulled back too quickly and Iruka only swiped the air. "Stop treating me like a kid," Iruka spluttered. "Then don't act like a kid." Hound finally opened the door, and Iruka stalked past him, treading on the edge of his foot as he went by in a mature and definitely not childlike way. Hound tugged on his ponytail in retaliation and then shut the door in his face when Iruka whirled around. "Asshole," Iruka hissed at the door, although it was secured with soundproofing seals. It didn't matter. Hound would know he was being insulted. God knew, his Iruka senses were definitely well honed. Iruka had lost count of the number of times Hound had popped up just in time to put a stop to whatever trouble he was brewing. It was infuriating. "Ah, Iruka, you made it." Sandaime was sitting at his desk, perusing some paperwork that must have been incredibly boring because he didn't even finish reading his page, not even the paragraph, before standing up and beckoning Iruka over to the balcony door. "Sorry I'm late," Iruka mumbled as Sandaime ushered him outside. "Not to worry. Take all the luxuries you can while you're still young. You won't always have time for lions." "Is there anyone Eagle didn't tell about my morning?" Iruka asked loudly, just in case Eagle was somewhere nearby. There was a low wooden table on the balcony, with a cushion on either side. Tea and cakes had already been laid out, and Iruka sat on his cushion and poured the tea without being asked. It was still steaming, and Iruka suspected it had only just been brewed, in anticipation of his lateness. Sometimes it was really annoying how efficient Umbu and their leader were. When Iruka grew up, he aspired to be as irritatingly on top of things, purely to spite them all. "I hear you had your first C-rank mission last week," Sandaime said as he lowered himself to the ground and arranged himself comfortably on the cushion. "Yeah, but it wasn't that exciting," Iruka sighed. "It was an escort mission, but nothing happened. Not a single bad guy tried to kill the client, and no one bothered us on our way home either." "Well, good," Sandaime said. "In that case it was easy money. But I wanted to kick some ass." Sandaime raised the teacup to his lips to unsuccessfully hide his smile. "Maybe next time. Although you'll cause my Umbu a lot of worry if you get into too much trouble, so be careful what you wish for." They were all a little on edge while you were out of the village. Iruka groaned loudly, also for the benefit of any Umbu who might be listening. He'd learned early on in this relationship, although he wasn't sure relationship was the right word when he was dealing with a covert group of elite assassins, that he had even less privacy than he'd had when his parents were still alive. And damn, had his dad been nosy. Why did they even know? Who told them? "You probably did," Sandaime said. "Right. There'd probably been an Umbu around when he'd received the mission, or when he'd been setting off with his team. And once one Umbu knew, they all would." He could barely fart without it making the Umbu bulletin these days, and he had no idea how things had ended up this way. Well, actually it may have had something to do with all those Umbu traps he'd built in the first few months after his parents' death. He hadn't actually caught an Umbu, but he'd captured their attention. Hey! Maybe those traps had been more successful than he'd thought. Sandaime passed him a cake, a delicate thing with cream and chocolate, barely big enough for 2 bites. Iruka was still full of toast, but he'd never let a full stomach get between him and dessert, and he stuffed the whole thing into his mouth. A blob of cream clung to his bottom lip and he was reminded of Hound's hand on his face, surprisingly gentle, and his cheeks grew hot all over again with the memory. "That jerk! Why do they care anyway?" he asked, deciding to ignore Hound's very existence. "All I've done over the past year is give them a collective headache, but for some reason they keep showing up and doing my laundry or asking me if I'm eating enough vegetables. It's kind of weird. Not that I'm not grateful, but I don't know what I've done to deserve that." Sandaime blew on his tea as he considered the question. Iruka appreciated that about him, that he always took Iruka's questions seriously. He'd heard enough bland platitudes from other adults to notice the ones who listened to him and gave him a proper answer, even if the answer was "I don't know." "There are a lot of different kinds of people in Umbu," Sandaime said slowly, "but some of them fall into a definite type. It's a difficult career, as I'm sure you know. The hours are long, the secrecy is isolating, and the risk to health and life is very high. More Umbu operatives die on the job than quit." Iruka had been reaching for a second cake but his hand faltered. "I didn't know that." Sandaime didn't look happy about that chilling statistic, but he didn't seem shaken by it either. He was resigned, as though it was merely one more sad fact in a world full of terrible truths. The type of people who take on a job like this are usually those who don't have much, if anything, to lose. Those without family or friends who would miss them. Those without commitments or dependents. They pledge themselves to the idea of the village rather than any particular people within it. I like to think that Umbu gives them a sense of meaning and camaraderie they wouldn't otherwise have, but they're also lonely people. He fixed Iruka with a level gaze that wasn't pitying but had a gentleness to it. "Maybe they recognize a part of themselves in you." Iruka didn't know what to say to that. He turned away, gazing across the rooftops of the village. The sun was approaching its zenith and the shadows were short, suffusing the streets with light. There were plenty of people, some hurrying and some strolling, ninjas and civilians, adults and children. In all the crowds of people he could see, Iruka probably couldn't call a single one of them his friend. There would be people he knew on the streets below. He had done his best to make himself infamous after his parents had died, substituting the irritation of strangers for the love of his parents, but very few of them liked him. He wasn't sure anymore what had happened to the friends he'd used to have. Had he pushed them away or had they left of their own accord? It was hard to remember that time directly after, full of funeral rites and days spent in bed until he lost track of the date. When he thought about it, and he didn't often left himself, he had trouble attaching a month to each memory. They slipped about out of order, all much the same. He had been alone in every moment, so what else was there to distinguish them? Until he'd started building traps. Until Umbu had started marking the days for him, a September afternoon when he'd sheltered from the rain and found Viper sharing his doorway to make idle small talk as the shower had passed by. A long December night when he couldn't sleep and had gone out to walk in the dead hours, underestimating the cold. Eagle had dropped down from a rooftop and handed him a coat. Had that been around the time he'd started leaving a hole in the wards for them, at the living room window? It must have been. It had been his own coat that Eagle had brought. Iruka remembered the goosebumps on Eagle's bare shoulders, and how he'd felt bad for pulling on an extra warm layer while Eagle had frozen in his uniform without complaint. "Are you trying to recruit me?" he asked, but it was a weak joke. Sandaime smiled all the same, a weary, melancholy smile. "I hope you won't be offended if I say that I pray you'll never join Umbu, Iruka," he said. "It wasn't on my to-do list anyway," Iruka said. "I see enough of Umbu already without spending every waking moment with them." "Perhaps they feel the same about you," Sandaime said mildly, and Iruka almost choked on his tea. "That better be a joke, old man," he said once he'd recovered. Sandaime was looking far too pleased with himself. "I'm great. There's only one Umbu who can't stand me and I don't care about his opinion anyway." "Oh? And who would that be?" Like he didn't know. Iruka jerked his head towards the office. "That asshole you have guarding your door right now." "No name calling please, Iruka," Sandaime said. He was frowning lightly. "It's a pity you and Hound don't get on. The two of you have certain things in common, I'd hoped you might become friends." Iruka wrinkled his nose. "We don't have anything in common," he corrected. Sure, he might not actually know anything about Hound, but there was no way he would accept any similarity between them, and it wasn't like Sandaime could tell him any personal details and ruin this truth he'd decided on. "Umbu took him under their wing as well at a young age," Sandaime said, shooting Iruka down with a single sentence. "Of course, he had to join their ranks first, but they've raised him between them. I suppose there are worse ways to grow up in this world but he hasn't had an easy time. I've often thought it's a pity he doesn't have more friends his own age." Iruka knew better than to ask how old Hound was. He'd figured from the way Hound behaved that he wasn't much older than Iruka, maybe 15 or 16. Iruka wouldn't consider that quite his age but from Sandaime's point of view, anyone younger than 20 was probably a child and therefore more or less the same level of maturity. He was so wrong. Iruka was way more mature than Hound. He refilled Sandaime's teacup and was about to say something cutting about Hound when he noticed the way Sandaime was looking at him. Sandaime's gaze was contemplative, maybe even calculating. Iruka had seen that look before. "What?" he asked sharply. "Iruka, how would you feel about taking on a solo mission for me?" Sandaime asked. Thrown by the change of topic, Iruka blinked at him. "A solo mission?" he asked. "Call it a B rank." That was so unexpected that Iruka almost forgot to be cautious. A B rank. He'd only just done his first C rank and Sandaime was trusting him with something even more important. Iruka didn't know how much a B rank mission paid, but it had to be good, and he could always use some extra cash. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Sandaime took a sip of tea. "Befriend Hound." Iruka spluttered. "That's not a B rank mission. That's not a mission at all. You're just bribing me to be nice to him." "I think the rank adequately reflects the difficulty," Sandaime said. "It won't be easy by any means, but I have faith you can do it if you set your mind to it." "Why would I even want to?" Iruka snapped. "Is payment not incentive enough?" "Well, all right. The payment was a pretty compelling reason." Damn Sandaime and his sneaky, meddling ways. Sandaime was watching him patiently, an expression of absolute serenity on his face, though Iruka was sure he was having a good internal chuckle at Iruka's expense. After a brief inner struggle, the lure of the money won out. "Fine," Iruka sighed. "I accept your stupid mission. But I'm only doing it for the money. Don't expect us to be best friends forever or anything." "Wonderful," Sandaime said without the slightest trace of sarcasm. I'll expect an update at our meeting next week. How had Iruka's day tanked so quickly? He'd barely been awake for an hour and he'd been signed up to play nice with his least favorite Umbu. If he'd known, he would have stayed in bed. Once they'd finished the tea, Sandaime put the remaining cakes into a box for him to take home, which Iruka protested only weakly. Then he stepped out of the office and found Hound waiting exactly where he'd left him half an hour ago. Iruka paused, unsure what he was supposed to do. Ask Hound to hang out sometime? It wasn't like they could meet up when Hound was off duty, not unless Hound was willing to wear the uniform in his downtime, and who would wear a mask for any longer than they had to. Hound didn't squirm under Iruka's gaze, but his shoulders tensed. Do I have something on my face? He asked. His tone was so deadpan that Iruka wasn't sure if he was making a mocking callback to the jam on Iruka's lips or if he was joking about his mask. Either way, he was being an asshole, and Iruka felt his temper flare. Think of the money, he told himself. So he swallowed his anger, forced his expression into something approaching neutral, a smile would have been too much to ask, and opened the box of cakes. Want one? He asked. It was Hound's turn to stare. First at Iruka, then at the cakes, and then at Iruka again. I can't eat on duty, he eventually said, gesturing to his mask. There was a hint of a question in his voice, probably wondering whether the cakes were poisoned. Iruka shut the box. Too bad, he said. You can swing by my place later if you want one. Hound was really staring now, and Iruka was starting to feel like an idiot, so he turned around without another word and hurried away. Hound didn't call after him, but Iruka felt his gaze on the back of his neck even after he'd turned the corner. The knowledge that Hound was still thinking about him bearing down on Iruka with the same weight as his physical presence. Iruka felt himself at the center of Hound's attention until he was halfway home and convinced himself that Hound would have been distracted by something else. Perhaps he'd been arrogant to think Hound had spared him a thought for even a few seconds after he'd gone. He wasn't sure which he would prefer. When Iruka got home, he left the box of cakes on the living room windowsill. 3 Umbu dropped by during the afternoon, and Iruka politely turned his back on each of them while they helped themselves to a cake. He was working on some seal's homework, making his way through a chapter in an old textbook his teacher had annotated to within an inch of its life. She had so many strong opinions about the contents that it was a wonder she'd recommended the book at all. There weren't any seals masters in Umbu, which was one of the reasons why Iruka had no aspirations to ever join their ranks. He'd asked Sandaime about it once, who'd said a seals master of the right quality would be more than welcome, but since Umbu meant long working hours and commitments to other forms of training, it didn't leave much time for research. It certainly wouldn't leave much time for a work-life balance. The occasional seals master had joined Umbu in the past, but none of the current specialists who might have qualified were interested in making the commitment. It was kind of a shame. Iruka liked his teacher, but it would have been nice if even one Umbu had understood his work. Most of them were happy to listen while he talked about it, but none of them really got it. On one hand, it was cool that he was learning things that even Umbu didn't have a clue about, but on the other, it was lonely. Seals was a rare specialism because of the complexity and the availability of pre-made seals at the shinobi supply store. Any shinobi could use them without understanding how they were made. Iruka knew of only one other apprentice and she was 19, so they didn't have much in common. Not friend material. Not that many Umbu were closer to his age. But they were in a different class somehow. Age didn't seem to matter as much when he didn't know their names or faces. He was still sitting on the couch with his back to the window when evening rolled around. He'd been so absorbed in the book that he barely noticed the time passing, and only when he found himself squinting against the gloom did he look up and notice how dark it was. Stretching, he got up and turned on the light, then turned around and saw the figure in the window. Fuck. Iruka clutched at his chest and closed his eyes, willing his heartbeat to slow down. Don't sneak up on me like that. Say hi or something, can't you? The Umbu didn't answer, and Iruka looked at him again, this time noting which mask he was wearing. His heart rate promptly picked up again. It was Hound. What are you doing here? He demanded, before remembering that he'd technically invited Hound over. He'd never expected Hound to actually show up. From the tense line of Hound's shoulders, Iruka suspected he was as happy with this situation as Iruka was. Hound tugged the window open a little further but didn't come in. He was clinging to the wall outside with Chakra, which couldn't be comfortable. "I finished my shift," he said, each word coming out clipped. Iruka had heard a whole range of Hound's emotions, ranging from unimpressed to frustrated to downright pissed off. This didn't quite fit into any of his pre-existing categories. If Iruka had to hazard a guess, he'd label it awkwardness. "If there's a cake left you can have it," Iruka said, gesturing to the box. I think the word got round. There was a rush for them. Hound looked into the box and then back up without reaching for one. "I don't really like sweets." Well, that was Iruka's suspicions confirmed, only a true psychopath would turn down free cake. "What are you doing here then?" Hound shifted his weight. Iruka was growing annoyed at the way he was lingering in the entryway, so to speak. "You were acting weird earlier," Hound said. That was it. He didn't follow it up, although there was that unspoken question in his voice again. Did he expect Iruka to know what he was talking about? "Weird how?" Iruka asked. Hound hesitated. "When you were leaving the Hokage's office," he said. Iruka was none the wiser. Had he been weird? Maybe he'd been giving Hound a strange look or something. His face must have looked totally blank, because Hound added, "You said something nice to me." Iruka spluttered. "That's not weird. I'm really nice. You're just too stuck up your own ass to recognize it." Hound's shoulders relaxed, as though he were put at ease by Iruka insulting him. "That bastard. Well. Good," he said. "I'll just leave now then." He was gone before Iruka could reply. Not that Iruka was sure what he would have said. If he wanted to complete his mission, he probably should have invited Hound in, but what the hell would they have done then? It wasn't like they had anything to talk about beyond trading insults. It wasn't like Hound actually wanted to spend any more time with him than necessary. Though, why had Hound come over anyway? To check up on him? Iruka was still standing in the middle of the room and staring at the open window like an idiot. Had Hound been worried about him? Because Iruka had offered him a cake? Iruka finally unstuck himself, crossing the room and closing the window. "Idiot," he muttered. "I am so nice. You're just an asshole." For the rest of the evening, he looked up at every noise from outside, half expecting Hound to come back. He didn't, of course, and it was a stupid notion. Hound never made social calls. Yet even though Iruka knew he was being an idiot, he couldn't stop his thoughts from drifting back to Hound. He wondered if Hound was thinking of him too.